So, welcome everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. Biggie D-Day from Nashville. So welcome, and we can have some country music in the background. Very happy to be talking to you today about these two essays that are in Jerome Kohn's new book, new collection, Thinking Without Banisters. The main essay that we're talking about is the Arendt's epilogue to her second edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism, and it's called The Hungarian Revolution and Totalitarian Imperialism. It was written in 1958, 2 years after the Hungarian Revolution, and published as an epilogue. She says in the very short little excerpt on totalitarianism, which follows it in this book, and which I included, that the reason she incorporates it and the reason she adds it are a few, but one is that the Hungarian Revolution, she says, taught her a lesson. This is on the last page of that little essay on totalitarianism. She says, if we take into account the amazing reemergence of the council system during the Hungarian Revolution, then it looks as though we are confronted with two new forms of government in our own time. And those two are, one, total domination, or totalitarianism, and two, the council system. And she says that the Hungarian Revolution gave her hope. And I think if we bring that into the context of the larger essay and the epilogue, I think the hopefulness is double. One is that totalitarian domination, which had been the sort of central feature of her work in the 40s, was generally not going to succeed. That, of course, totalitarian movements could emerge, totalitarian domination could largely assert itself, but that it was very unlikely, A, that it would ever fully assert itself, and B, that it would last. And I think in Origins itself, that optimism is not always present. There's a question mark about it. She talks about the holes of oblivion. Is it possible to create these holes of oblivion where memory and facts disappear and a complete, totally dominant, coherent fictional narrative completely takes over and erases all spontaneity and all freedom from the world? I think she's suspicious of it happening, and she sees the failure in Eichmann in Jerusalem. She makes the very confident assertion that totalitarian domination does not exist. And I think that's a much stronger claim. And in many ways, the Hungarian Revolution gives her some of this hope and confidence. Part of it is because of the rise of the council system, but the other part of it is simply that it happened. That it was so difficult for the Russian totalitarian total domination to exert itself, not only in Russia, where she thinks it didn't fully ever exert itself, and there's examples of that, but more importantly in the satellite states. And what she comes to see is that in the satellite states of Eastern Europe, it was simply unlikely and impossible that the kind of deep internal ideological coherence needed for totalitarian domination would emerge. And so she writes this epilogue and this essay as an expression of this hope. Now, one of the problems that I think we have to deal with, and I think it's an open question in Arendtian scholarship, is that she then, in her lifetime, published two other editions of The Origins of Totalitarianism, the third and fourth editions. And she removed the epilogue from both of those editions. And she never really explained why, at least not that I know of, which raises a serious question, which is, did she mean for it to be taken back? Did she come to disagree with it in some way? What is the reason that she decides to pull the epilogue and not ever explain why she does so? I don't know how many of you were at the first ever Hannah Arendt Center conference all the way back in 2006. But at that conference, the writer Christopher Hitchens made this question of why she pulled the epilogue from The Origins after the second edition into the topic of his paper. And you can read it if you have that book that we give out to people who are members at $100, not to make a plug or anything. But it's the Thinking in Dark Times volume that I edited along with Tom Keenan and Jeff Katz. And Hitchens makes the suggestion that Arendt became aware only later, specifically in reviewing another book about the Hungarian Revolution, how deeply anti-Semitic the Hungarian Revolution was, and how the councils, which she of course lauds in these books, were very much compromised by a serious level of anti-Semitism. And Hitchens' argument or suggestion, because he doesn't prove it, he just says this may be the explanation, was that because she became aware of the deep anti-Semitism that had adhered in the council movement, she didn't want to continue to present it as this kind of positive utopic vision, and she pulled it in later editions. There's no actual evidence for that. It's just a hypothesis. I think it's a meaningful one. And the fact is, I've never heard of another one. And so it is, I think, an open question why she pulled it. It'd be a great topic for some sort of research if someone had some clues as to where to look. In any case, the essay is split into three parts. The first part is on Russia. The second part is on the Hungarian Revolution. And then the third is on the status of these satellite states. I think the main part, which is also interesting, I think the shortest, the one that most interests us, is the part on the Hungarian Revolution itself. But I just point out one or two things to keep in mind as we read this. So at the beginning of the essay, I think on page 4 of it, which is page 108, she speaks about 2/3 of the way down the page, the secret desires of the modern masses, who, lonely as they are, cannot bear to remain on the sidelines and not join in. So this is an important comment written in 1958 before Eichmann in Jerusalem. But I mean, we have to remember and read it within this context. One of her central theses in the Eichmann book is that Eichmann is a joiner. He's someone who's lonely and in need of belonging to a movement. And, you know, in that age-old debate now, 70-year-old debate between those who wonder whether Eichmann is a revision of Origins or a continuation of it, this strikes me as a suggestion that Eichmann is a continuation of it. If you read The Origins of Totalitarianism as I do, and as I did with you when we read it, as very much and importantly and essentially marked by the really only 15 to 20 pages in the 500-page book that address the question of loneliness and homelessness and rootlessness, but I think are the driving spirit and forces of the book. You get to this idea that the secret desires of the modern masses is to belong, which leads to this secret desire for conformity and for coherence and for a fictional narrative. And this is so much of what, as I understand it, drives Arendt's understanding of totalitarianism. Once we get to the actual Hungarian Revolution itself, there's the question of how she understands it and why it's so important. The driving idea is that this was an elite revolution. It was a revolution by communist elites, but in Poland and Hungary, those communist elites were the old guard communists. They hadn't yet been already replaced, and as a result, they were still believers, and that's an important part for her. This was a revolution that began by communist believers and then switched into non-communist believers, but where they all believed in freedom. And it was a revolution driven by freedom and a belief in freedom, not inequality. She writes on 127. Now, Johanna had written that she found on page 127 that the spirit that inspired the protests of the Hungarian people in 1956 to seek freedom is replaced by a movement to the right. I'm still not sure exactly where that is on page 127, Johanna, but
I'm looking at the last large paragraph on page 127. She seems to be.
Can you read it for me?
I don't have my book in front of me. I'm sorry. I'm actually on the road as I'm listening to you.
Okay.
It's.
Great.
I have the book. I have the book itself, so it's not the PDF file. And so
it should be the same.
It's more that spirit in which she writes about the geist that the young people had in Hungary at that time, advocating for freedom. And so I wondered why that spirit seems to have dissipated or even disappeared to be replaced by what we're seeing as intolerance and this kind of move toward the right, not just in Hungary, but in other Eastern European countries. And so I wondered what anyone thought about that. And also, why have the Hungarian people seem to have lost that spirit?
Well, the Hungarian people today, well, this is 70 years later.
A given, but
yeah. Well, I think so. Let's start from the beginning. She says that the Polish and Hungarian developments were similar, right? They both were led by people who were not puppets, not just mere agents, but were, people who still had ideals and had violent dissatisfaction with what was going on. By setting the tragic fate of Hungary before the eyes of the Polish people, Gomulka succeeded in stopping the rebellion so that Polish people also missed out on this exhilarating experience, whereas the Hungarians, she says, had that experience of unfurling the flag of freedom in plain view. She doesn't always write like that, but it's nice when she does. So this is her argument. She says that even after the revolution is crushed, in the next year, people celebrate its anniversary. How much longer they do so is not, obviously she's writing this only 2 years after, so it's hard to say. But I mean, I think one can point to the 1989 revolutions throughout Eastern Europe, and to a large degree, say that many of them were still inspired by this spirit that Arendt is identifying here. Why not today? Well, that's an interesting question. Why is there a rebellion against it? Clearly, I mean, that brings us a bit far afield, but Viktor Orban is a fascinating figure in Hungary, a leftist who was supported by the Soros philanthropies as a leftist thinker, who has clearly become a right-wing ideologue, but very much of a nationalist figure, and this is one of the things she talks a lot about in this essay, the sort of kind of a nationalist revanche, nationalist deviance that emerges in some of these situations. When does it emerge? Well, to some degree, when people need to consolidate power and are less interested in the ideology than they are in simply consolidating power. I'm not sure why it's right wing or left wing. I don't think there's any meaningful response to that or meaningful distinction. But I'm happy to hear other thoughts. The key here in this section is on pages one of the key sections is pages 128 to 29. What Arendt is interested here is how this cry for freedom that we saw emerge in Hungary and in parts of Eastern Europe was very much a cry for freedom, driven by the fact that the fictional world collapsed under the weight of fact, as she puts it at the bottom of 128. There was simply there was an opportunity, and that what happened is that the fictional world of the Hungarian communist government no longer could assert itself. It never had fully asserted itself, and there was now an opening for people to say simply, we don't believe it, it's not true. And she talks about certain examples of how this happened in Russia as well. One, Dunetsyev's novel, Not by Bread Alone, and the other, Pasternak. And the Pasternak example is really wonderful. You know, he does translations of Shakespeare and Goethe, and then falls silent for years, and only writes samizdat, never writes publicly, doesn't speak publicly. And what she says is his silence, in a way, allowed him to live and survive, and yet people knew him and knew him as a dissident. There's an interesting corollary for those of you who've read her remarks on Karl Jaspers in Men in Dark Times, where she says that Jaspers' silence spoke volumes during the Nazi regime, and that it was evidence to all who knew him throughout the war that there were good people who could not be corrupted by the Nazis. And so she says in the essay on Jaspers in Men in Dark Times, his silence, his internal exile, was proof that the human character could hold out against total domination. And all who knew him knew that that proof existed as long as he was there, and that was an essential and important fact that prevented the complete total domination, even in Nazi Germany. And she says about Pasternak that the miracle through which he survived and the incredible strength to remain silent for decades, she says, is the only support. He is the only splendid living pillar supporting the hopes that Orwell's 1984 is just a nightmare. So here she says about Pasternak, the fact that he persisted shows that Orwell's totalitarianism cannot be realized. There will be people like Pasternak and like Jaspers who somehow persist in their humanity, and that is support for the idea that fantasies of totalitarianism are just that. In the end, fantasies, they'll not be fully realized. And she tells that wonderful story about how at one point Pasternak goes to read a poem at a reading, and the paper slipped from his hand, and she says, a voice from the hall began to recite the poem from memory, and from several corners of the hall, other voices joined in, and the recitation of the poem ended uninterrupted in a chorus. Point is, people read him and knew him even if they couldn't talk about it. And yet that fact that he existed and was known was evidence that even then, this was in 1946, Russia was not a totalitarian state. And this is part of the hopefulness that I think he finds also in the rise of the spontaneity of the Hungarian Revolution. That is what interests her. The other main point that I really want to at least focus on is on page 131. She says she's beginning to talk about these council systems. And she says the real question, this is the bottom of 131, the question was not how various freedoms should be approached. The freedom of thought and speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to act and vote. Those emerged, and the question wasn't how to do them, how to engage them. It was, she says, quote, how to stabilize a freedom that was already an accomplished fact and to find the right political institutions for it. So this is a really important question. And for those of you who read On Revolution, either with us or on your own, this is the main question she's engaged with in chapters 4 and 5 of On Revolution, which is, it's one thing for the American Revolution to have had the experience of power that emerged through constituting itself. But the question was how to stabilize and concretize that power in institutions. And this becomes a question of authority. How do you create an authority that makes the institutions lawful and yet not oppressive? And she says that in Hungary, you saw these councils emerge, and immediately they were authoritative. They had authority. They were seen as extraordinary, powerful, but also councils and powers that had to be listened to. They had an authority to them. And she says on the next page, 132, never a revolution achieved its aim so quickly, so completely, and with so little bloodshed. I mean, this was the fastest and most successful revolution ever, with the caveat that it lasted for 12 days. And once it fell apart, it was unable to put it back together, which raises the question of maybe it happened too fast. But I think if you go back and think it in relation to the On Revolution text, it may also be that there just wasn't the deep preparation for it, that the American experience of constitutions and constitutional republics and constitutional conventions had been going on since the colonial period. And therefore, there was a long history and a preparation for these institutions that would preserve and activate freedom. And those were lacking in Hungary. In addition, in Hungary, of course, they had the Russians come in and destroy it. But in any case, she spends the next 5 to 7 pages talking about the council system. And she sees the council system as the great new form of the other great new form of government that emerged with totalitarian domination. She says the councils had existed prior to totalitarian domination with the Soviets and with other experiences in the Paris Commune, but that it was really in response to the totalitarian domination in the Hungarian Revolution that for the first time the councils came to be seen as a meaningful alternative to the party system, which is why they were so quickly squashed and why they became the real enemy that the Russians sought to eliminate. The principle, she says, of these councils, and this is by far the most articulate description of councils that Arendt has, although there's some of it also in On Revolution. The principles of the councils, as she understands it, is that they are an alternative to the party system, and that don't take positions because of the fact that they're part of the party positions. You don't take party lines. You take your own line, and everyone thinks only for themselves and offers only their personal positions. And the people who are selected to be the leaders of the councils, it's not because they replicated a party line. It's that they expressed a certain personal qualification or talent to express themselves, and won the confidence of the people. And as each council finds its leaders that it most respects and trusts, those leaders then go up and join with the leaders of other councils and form higher councils, who then join up higher councils, eventually till you get a higher supreme council. Arendt never fully develops this idea, but this is her understanding of how a truly democratic council government might work. It's an alternative to representative democracy. So for those of you who were at or have watched the video of the lecture 2 weeks ago at Bard with David van Reybrouck from Belgium, David van Reybrouck is interested in alternative to electoral representative democracy, which he thinks is anti-democratic, through the idea and use of lottery. Arendt also agrees that electoral representative democracy is not very democratic. She doesn't turn to lottery, she turns to the council system. I actually think Reybrouck's is more rooted in historical success. There have been historically lasting democratic governments in which most of the representatives were chosen by lottery. There's never been a lasting democratic country or people in which the representatives were chosen through the council system. So this is one of those situations where I think Arendt and Reybrouck have a similar analysis of the problem. For whatever reason, and I'm not sure if she was aware of it or not, Arendt really never, as far as I know, discusses lottery as a means of government, even though it was one that was widely used in Greece and widely used throughout much of the Renaissance Italy area. She doesn't ever mention it. So it's the council systems that are really the source of her interest in the Hungarian Revolution. So let's stop there and let's see if there are some conversations that we want to have about the Hungarian Revolution, councils, democracy, etc. Thoughts? Bob asked whether the analysis of Russian succession after Stalin stood the test of time. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the scholar who's written most on this is actually a friend of mine named Peter Baer. I know we published some of his work, and some of you may have come across him. And one of the things that Peter has done is ask the question of to what extent post-Stalinist Russia is totalitarianism, remains totalitarian, and he's actually expanded that question to China, Maoist China, and even later China. And he's also asked, I think, very important questions, which we all should be asking. It's the basic question of to what extent is totalitarianism, does it emerge today, including in countries like the United States? I think Arendt obviously had limited access to information about both Stalinist Russia and post-Stalinist Russia. But I don't know to what extent we can say her is there a particular aspect of her analysis that you're interested in, Bob, that stood the test of time? I mean, I think the general argument that it was not a complete totalitarian domination is right. Her claim here that it may not have ever been a complete total domination even under Stalin. If that's right, clearly it's also right under Khrushchev. So I'm not sure. Can you say more about which part of her analysis you're interested in? I mean, this may test my knowledge of Russian history, so we'd have to go in that direction.
Well, I just have something of a favorable impression of Khrushchev because he pulled the missiles out of Cuba, albeit getting
he also put them in Cuba.
Quo. Yeah.
Yeah.
But who was the bigger gambler, Khrushchev or Kennedy? And my impression is that maybe Khrushchev evolved, and if he did, what does that say about the totalitarian question? His speech, was it just before the Hungarian Revolution where he talked about Stalin's crimes? And then that, of course, unleashed, maybe helped unleash some of the reaction in Eastern Europe. But nevertheless, Khrushchev, whatever his early years might say about him, his later years, given the circumstances, deserve some credit.
Yeah, I think that's a fair analysis. I mean, I think Arendt reads him in the early years as simply one of the many people striving for power. From the idea that she has is that in a totalitarian government, the rulers don't pay much attention to secession. And the main reason it seems that they don't is that they sort of assume that the apparatus will work itself out, A, and B, that the people who are left are generally all people who are have been successful in the struggle for domination. So they're going to all be people who can run things. But obviously, when the actual succession happens, there's a vacuum and there's a power struggle. And Khrushchev was brutal and Machiavellian in his use of Zhukov and others. And what he did is, once Beria was eliminated, he understood that the power would be with the army, and he got the army on his side. That's her analysis. It's simply about the attempt to accumulate power. It wasn't in her mind a deeply committed totalitarian ideal. And it does seem that Khrushchev was much more sort of governed by questions of power than by questions of ideology. But I'll have to leave it at that. I'm not sure I have much more to say. If anyone else does, I'm happy to listen. So there's a question from Jennifer. Can you discuss what she writes at the end of page 132 through the first paragraph of page 133? Ideological superstructure having disintegrated more swiftly, the one thing brought about by this collapse of ideology was the reality of the revolution itself. Yeah, so what she's interested in here is the way that, and she says this happened also, she says this in Origins as well, happened in Germany as well. As soon as Hitler lost the war, as soon as Germany lost the war, suddenly it was like people snapped and everyone was cured of their Nazism. And you can call this simply, cynical, or well, suddenly we go with the victor. But I think she has a different view of it. She thinks that as long as the ideological apparatus and the ideological world upholds the fiction, and all facts, all reality that disarms or disrupts the fiction are attacked and discredited, even if the attacks and discredited are not right, because obviously you can't simply attack and discredit facts in a right way. But if you continue to constantly question the assertion of reality and fact, you allow the fantasy of a coherent ideology to continue. And I think a lot of people are struggling to understand in this country how certain factions politically are able to keep lying and lying and lying, and not. And even though a lot of people who support, for example, the president, know that specific things he says are untrue, they hold on to this idea that he's expressing a larger truth. And the way to understand that is through an ideological analysis. He is offering an ideology. He's offering a coherent ideological worldview. And facts alone can't pierce that worldview, because the people who are part of that worldview, who believe in that ideology, are not simply believing it because it's true. They're believing it, and I go back to what I said at the very beginning of this discussion, the secret desire of lonely people, of the lonely masses, to fully join in. And the secret desire to fully join in comes from a need to find one's purpose and meaning in being part of a movement, something that gives them a sense of purpose in the world. And as long as every time a new fact emerges that will challenge that ideology, as long as you shoot it down, you attack it, you question it, you make it so that it is no longer, you disarm its power to pierce your fiction, the ideology will hold. But what she's saying is, in Hungary, the ideology was people were not actually buying into the ideology. They were mouthing it. They were going along with it, but they didn't actually buy into it. So as soon as somebody stood up to it, as soon as the students protested, people said, "No way, this is wrong," and it just fell apart immediately. That's the collapse of ideology. Václav Havel, I think, expresses this in his essay, The Power of the Powerless, in which he talks about that famous greengrocer who's given a sign on whatever it is, May Day or some communist holiday, to put in his window that says, some statement of the party. And he knows that that he puts it in, no one bothers him, he just does it. And it's the right thing to do, because it'll allow him to keep selling his groceries and not get in trouble. And yet one day he just says enough and doesn't put it in. And then everyone else takes their signs down and it starts a revolution. Well, that can only happen when the superstructure, what she calls this ideological superstructure, has already disintegrated. But it won't actually happen until somebody acts, until the revolution happens, and that's when it will collapse. I think then another thing that I think about is one of the things that one of the claims in the Eichmann book that always really touched me is her claim that one of the reasons Eichmann could continue to do what he did and believe what he believed is because he never saw anybody question what they were doing. He was just this lowly vacuum salesman, but all the intellectuals, all the popes and all the generals, everyone he came into contact with didn't question what they were doing. And she says, that sort of held up the fantasy and made it easy for him to feel like he was part of something that lots of people, including his betters, believed in and were part of. And as I take it, that's the superstructure. Does that help out, Jennifer?
That because I was applying it to the situation we're in where, Trump goes on about fake news, fake news, fake news. And I go on Twitter and I go on Facebook and everyone's like screaming about it. Like, how can he say this? And he keeps saying it. And it sort of sails through the news, which I try not to watch a lot. But when I turn it on and I watch, they're kind of rationalizing it too. And they do it in the press pool in the White House. And some people have started to attack that. But I'm kind of grappling with that. And that passage in the essay just really stood out to me.
I think it does. I think one of the things we're all grappling with is to what extent can facts pierce the veil of an ideological superstructure or a coherent fictional narrative. I mean, I think there's a couple steps to the argument. One that Arendt really gets, and I think is not understood enough by a lot of her readers, is that the first step is the experience of loneliness and homelessness in modern society. And that leads to an existential need to join and belong. The next step is that once you create a movement that people can belong to, if you want to keep that movement growing and going, it can't have endpoints. You can't have a movement for healthcare and then get healthcare and then say, okay, we're done, because then people don't know what to believe in and don't find a sense of belonging. It's no longer a politics of interest; it's a politics of movement. That's part of her analysis. So in a lonely mass age, movements will replace interests, which is why classes will dissolve, because classes are based on interests, and be replaced by mass movements. If you want that movement to continue, it has to constantly aim at ever higher and more difficult to attain ends, because it can never stop. But as it moves from simply healthcare to something else, it's going to deal with the fact that in order to make that claim, it's going to have to lie. It's going to have to tell fictions. It's going to have to kill people who oppose it. And yet people will have a deep need to believe in it. And they can continue to believe in it. She's arguing, and I think she's right, even if they're aware of the fact that there are facts that oppose it, so long as they feel that it represents a higher truth. And so how do you attack, or how do you puncture that ideological superstructure? Well, on one level, there's a couple things. One, you have to give people something else to believe in, right? So if you're going to fight it, you got to fight it with another idea, another fiction, which of course is dangerous because that fiction can become totalitarian. Or you can try and fight it simply with facts, but facts alone are not going to do it so long as that original movement continues to provide people something that gives themselves meaning and purpose. And that's the catch that you're in. How do you, obviously there's a movement on the right and there's movements on the left that are defactual and yet purposeful, and people are joining them because they find meaning in it. And they feed off each other, because even though the people on the right know that part of what they're saying, as Jennifer said, is wrong, is infactual, what they say is, well, it's not as unfactual as what the people on the left are doing and saying. And then the people on the left say, yeah, okay, we're exaggerating too, but we're not exaggerating as bad as the people on the right. And it becomes a point in which everybody knows that their movement and their world is not purely factual, but they think it's more factual and better than the other people's movements. And that leads to the kind of deepest threat to our way of life, which is cynicism, in which we just don't believe that there are any truths or any facts, and it's all about keeping our movement on top or in power. And that is, I think, the great danger of politics today. Bob writes, the desire of lonely people to belong may be true of the trumpeters in one respect, but even stronger, in my opinion, is the bread and circus that Trump provides. One neglected aspect of Hitler's rise and strength was that he was fun for those receptive to the message. Fun and engaging distraction trumps belonging. Yeah, I think bread and circus is a big part of it. I mean, this goes back to Bonapartism as well, which was a big part of his rise and rule. I think bread and circus go along with the idea of distracting us from and giving a sense of joining and purpose to what we're doing. There's a sense of being part of a movement that one feels empowered and one feels important. I mean, I think you definitely see this in Eichmann, but I think you can see it in a lot of people who are engaging in politics today on both the right and the left. Everyday people who were just, bakers or security guards suddenly feel like they are soldiers in a civilizational war. And that's a nice feeling for a lot of people. I mean, it means you're a public figure and you've got a lot of people attacking you and there's negatives to it, but suddenly you're important. I mean, that was certainly part of what attracted Eichmann to what he did, that feeling of importance. And I think what you see today with the rise of blogs and citizen warriors and things of this sort is just a lot of everyday people who feel deeply empowered and important. And that's part of the bread and circus. Daphne writes, I just read an interesting article about Alan Dershowitz and his reversal from civil liberties to a constant defense of Trump. I think loneliness is the real reason he does so. Yeah, Dershowitz is a complicated case, and I certainly don't claim to know or understand a lot about him. I don't think you can understand Dershowitz without understanding his analysis of the left and its betrayal of facts on Israel. Now, I'm not saying he's right or wrong. I don't want to really get into that right now. But for Dershowitz, he sees the complete, in his mind, the complete abdication of reality in people saying that Israel is the greatest threat to world peace and that Israel is a totalitarian nation and Israel is an apartheid state. In his view, there are plenty of states in the world worse than Israel. And I think on that, I'm going to at least say I think he's right. That doesn't mean Israel is innocent in any shape or form. But there are plenty of states in the world that are worse than Israel, and there are plenty of states that are bad, And there's plenty of things that the United States does that is quite morally questionable. And Dershowitz's point over and again is that the left has become, in a sense, fixated on Israel in a way that shows an ideological obsession, and in his view is deeply anti-Semitic. So that's been his main issue for many years now. I don't think you can understand his turn away from the left in isolation from that. Now, why he's embraced Trump, I don't have a good sense. But I think, okay, I don't know what you meant by loneliness. I mean, clearly he was someone who was once a member of the left who feels alone. I mean, I think there's a lot of people on the left right now who feel abandoned by the left. Insofar, a lot of old civil libertarians, people who believed in free speech, civil liberties, and suddenly feel like the new identitarian left is not a home for them, and suddenly they went from being powerful and popular members of the left to being somewhat isolated. So maybe that's what you mean by loneliness. I don't want to get too psychological about it in that sense. I don't know Dershowitz. I'm not a psychologist, but I do think you have to take seriously his feelings of betrayal by the left on the issue that has really dominated his thinking for the last 5 or 10 years.
I think Professor Dershowitz is sorry I messed his name up, but I think his focus is on the literal legal aspects of the Trump outrages. I don't think you get him defending the outrages. I think you tend to get him looking at the technical black letter of the law versus the outrage, the justifiable outrage of the left against Trump. And I think that's what I'm pretty sure. I might feel that he takes this kind of narrow legal lecture attitude when he is discussing those kinds of things, not that he favors Trump and the nonsense of Trump. But that's I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. Let's put it that way when I hear him, because most people, when they respond to him saying, well, we all know that such and such happened, even though from his point of view it has not been proven in a court of law and hasn't been proven according to the legal things that apply. That's my interpretation of the professor anyway.
The professor apparently is seriously a constitutional lawyer, and he tries to defend everything in the Constitution. So regardless of his feelings about Israel, the article claims that his defense of Trump is not selective, it's not well thought out, and that the harm that he's doing is greater than the good that he's doing in finding articles within the Constitution that would support Trump. And the article also said, it's a very long article and I can't remember where I read it, but it said that he is now sort of out in the cold, and sort of like Giuliani needs the attention, and the best place he can get it, because he's not being invited to CNN, is on Fox News. So that could be a form of the geriatric club of lonely people who are now supporting Trump. Sorry if I'm flippant, but I'm very annoyed with Dershowitz.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to completely psychoanalyze the guy because I don't know him, but I think the general idea is he has, for many years, he was a man of the left and a man of the civil liberties, and I think he has come to believe that on a number of issues, the left has become ideological and unhinged from fact. And he is now sees himself, as you guys both just said, a sort of constitutional, reminding people that whether or not you agree with Trump, whether or not you like Trump, he has not violated the Constitution. He has not broken the law. I mean, I think one of the biggest questions that a lot of us face, you consider someone like Donald Trump, and I think it's an important question, is he simply the president, and we have to continue to go and act along the lines of a normal president, or is he an exception that has to be resisted? I think this is the question everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people are faced with. You know, the New York Times and the Washington Post immediately came out and said, we are now part of the resistance. Is that productive? Should they imagine themselves part of the resistance, or should they imagine themselves what they always are, supposed to be the fourth estate, looking after and trying to hold power accountable, but not differently than they would under any other president? Insofar as they imagine themselves part of the resistance, they're suggesting that this is an extraordinary situation, and that risks their losing their objectivity and losing their sense of the respect and the authority that they have long had. I think one of the things Dershowitz is doing, and I think is exactly what I think Patrick just said, is taking an extraordinarily legal and constitutional response to this question and saying, nothing Trump has done has been unconstitutional. Nothing Trump has done has moved this to be not a normal presidency on a legal constitutional basis. Now, I think I don't know. I haven't looked at it 100%, and where there's some arguments one could make, but in general, that's been correct so far, I think. I mean, I don't want to, I'm not making a strong claim on that, but as far as I know. But there's another claim, which is, you know, that all of his instincts are clearly, to many people, anti-democratic and deeply authoritarian, and the line between him being a legal and lawful president and him empowering potentially violent fascist squads is small. And so one answer, you know, there's different ways to respond to that. One is, don't trust him. Engage in violence against him now. And yet the problem is that gives him no reason to keep remaining legal and constitutional. Another view is resist him non-violently. And then another view is, say, normalize him. I think these are all arguments to be made. I mean, I think in the last week's Amor Mundi, if you haven't read it, I encourage you to take a look at it. There's a very interesting review of Mark Bray's book on Antifa. Mark Bray is going to be speaking at the conference in October. You know, and Mark Bray's position, as far as I vaguely understand it, and the Antifa position is that you can't wait for the fascists to really become fully fascist before you violently oppose them, because then it will be too late. The people reviewing it, who are both part of the nonviolent resistance movements, basically say, in general, if you start using violence to respond to fascists before they're fascist, the most likely effect of that will be to encourage them to actually use violence and then to become full-on fascists, and that it would be better to not engage in that kind of a violent response. Well, Dershowitz, I think, is making a different argument, not about Antifa, but about how we in the cultural wars should respond to Trump. Clearly, Trump is violating norms and ideological, excuse me, and is engaged in a kind of fictionalizing that is deeply cynical and disruptive. But do we engage and respond to him with a kind of fictionalizing and ideological coherence on another side, or do we simply try and keep pointing out the facts? It's a very hard question, because what we've all learned is simply pointing out the facts doesn't usually win the case. And so the incentive, or there's a lot of desire to move from that to being ideological on the other side. And I think Dershowitz, I don't know what he's saying, but I'll say from my understanding, the risk of becoming ideological from the other side is that we erase all belief in a common factual world, and everybody simply becomes part of ideological movements. And that while it doesn't seem like simply pointing out the facts does something, it actually does, I think, more than many of us realize. It keeps those who we are constantly challenging on the defensive. They constantly have to buttress their argument. And there will be times when their argument is shown to be naked, shown to be unsupportable. And while it may not mean that they are impeached or killed or destroyed, it does constantly make it harder for them to keep that narrative coherent. But I mean, these are strategic questions, and I think they're important strategic questions. And I don't know what really is driving Dershowitz, but I do think he's making this argument that we can't jump from the other ideology simply because we don't like this ideology.
Roger, I want to jump in because I guess the use of the word ideology feels a little confusing to me. First of all, I don't think Trump has an ideology, so it's hard to attribute that to him. And to people such as the, religious right, whatever ideology they may have had, they don't seem to be paying much attention to as well. And it kind of goes back to this idea with Arendt's discussion of the councils, that if there's no ideology, if there's no platform or policy, and all you're talking about is trusting in individuals, how does that not wind up to be just a cult of personality? So I guess I see you using the word ideology as a negative.
Susan, I lost you. Did other people lose Susan?
No.
You can't hear me?
Oh, okay. I heard most of it, but
Okay.
you blocked out at the end.
Okay. So I just wonder, how no ideology at all doesn't wind up to be just cult of personality, and using the concept of ideology as a negative. I mean, if ideology is believing healthcare is a right, to me, that's a positive ideology. That's something, to be believed in.
I mean, an ideology is a pseudoscientific claim of certainty, as Arendt understands it, and I think it's a helpful interpretation of it. Communism obviously had an ideology. Trump, you're saying, and I largely agree with you, doesn't have an ideology, except he does. His one ideology is winning or power. And as long as it wins, it's justified. Now, that's a weak ideology conceptually. It doesn't have, any deep idealistic claim to make the world more just or better. But there's a certain glorification of strength and virility and maleness that I think is at least in some ways the highest principle that governs what Trump is after. But it doesn't. But the point is, it's incredibly flexible and can be used to support the Iran deal one day and not the next day, and same with the Paris Accords. So it's a very flexible and plastic ideology, if we call it an ideology. So you could call it a cult of personality. Yeah.
Can I jump in for a second, Roger? Sam?
Yeah.
Susan, I think one of the things that Arendt really draws out in this particular essay is that ideology is not always a coherent, logical or rational system of thought like communism or the isms that she talks about at the end of The Origins. She talks about the ideological impulse and ideology as a way of thinking, a way of being oriented politically that is actually anti-political. So it's not, and she has the great line in this essay about how, like even a totalitarian leader changes his mind, right? There's no strategic consistency necessarily. It has more to do with a way of thinking which drives one toward both a right to know and a desire to be right in their knowing, I think, which she juxtaposes to claims of freedom. She puts freedom and acting in concert and talking about revolution and resistance on the opposite side of ideological rigidity, which is another phrase she uses in this particular essay. And I think that's what, when Roger, you were talking about, the kind of strange alliance that we see happening, which is an old alliance between far left ideology and far right ideology, that it has more to do with a desire to kind of stake a certain political claim on what is happening right now and to pick up power through those claims, than it does to maintain any kind of centrist ground where one is open to thinking and engaging in politics in a way that would be more in line with a traditional kind of civil libertarian agenda, the right to free speech, as opposed to this constant policing of speech ad infinitum.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see much difference between this and her understanding of ideology in Origins, but I think what Sam is saying is right. It's ideology is a pseudo-scientific claim for coherence, and that one idea can change the world, can explain the world. But I mean, any good communist knows that. I mean, the brilliance of communism is that everything that happens fits exactly with Marxist ideology, even though it seems to completely oppose it. I mean, that's the,
that's why we call it orthodox Marxism.
Right. I mean, Marxism is one of the most plastic ideologies you could imagine. Same with Nazism. Same with Darwinism. All these ideologies are incredibly flexible and plastic, which is why they're not sciences. That she calls them pseudosciences. And what I think what you're saying, Suzanne, is and I think is something I've said in the past, and I think it needs to be understood, is that Trump doesn't seem to have one of these sort of overarching ideologies, except his ideology is we must win at all costs and at all times. That is a kind of ideology. It's a kind of claim that, I mean, one of the sort of astounding aspects of Trump's behavior is how he never admits he's wrong, right? I mean, even look at a few of the issues that he's had to backtrack on, like the birther one where he had called Obama and said he wasn't a citizen and stuff. He never actually has said, I was wrong. He at times has said, of course he was a citizen. And then other times he goes back and says he's not. I don't know if he is, but he'll never admit he's wrong. And that is sort of the key to ideological thinking, is that you have this and for him, it is simply that, I'm never wrong, and we will always achieve the best, and we will always make America great again. I don't know what to call his ideology in any kind of, it's not a traditional one.
Can I ask you, I'm very confused. So is ideology pejorative? Is that what you're saying? That Hannah Arendt uses the term ideology as a pejorative?
Well, ideology is a thoughtlessness. It's an idea. It's a claim that one idea can explain all things in the world. And so from her point of view, it is of necessity a simplification of the complexity of the world. I mean, to say that, the rise of the working class and the oppression of them by the bourgeoisie is the one idea that will explain everything in the world. Or to say with Darwin that natural selection is the one idea that can explain who's going to win and who's going to lose in the world, to social Darwinism, or any ideology that thinks that one idea can sort of triumph is a radical simplification of the world, claimed in the name of science, but one that is unscientific. So pejorative, yeah, it's a pejorative. I mean, ideological thinking is simplified thinking for her.
Roger, could I just jump? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Patrick.
You go ahead, Harold. Go.
When we talk about ideology, however you're going to define it, and Trump, I think it's important to understand that there is an ideology practiced and preached by prosperity televangelists, which is quite popular in the religious right, which is why they, in my view, have the support of him that they do, which is your relationship to God is directly relatable to how well you're doing in the world. And if you look at guys like T.D. Jakes, they have millions of people following them and sending them money because they really worship prosperity. And Trump has presented himself as an extremely prosperous guy, even though we know he isn't.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether he is or isn't. I mean, those are, again, one of these things where we've lost all. No side has the facts, and everyone thinks they know the truth. I have no idea. But I think your general point is absolutely right. 13 years ago, I spent a lot of time feeding my first child late at night, us watching late night TV. And one of the things that I had it was around the time when someone had been taken hostage, and they had convinced their hostage taker to let them go by reading with them and quoting the book, The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren, who was one of the original evangelical church creators of Saddleback Church out in California. And the TV late at night was filled with discussions of Rick Warren and this book, The Purpose-Driven Life, which I learned at the time was the best-selling book in America in the 20th century besides the Bible, which I had not known. So I went and read The Purpose-Driven Life and read a bit about it. And I was working on a project on it that, of course, I never finished. But the point is that what Rick Warren understood is, as he said, that his mentor was not, he was the founder of the largest church for a long time in the United States. And his mentor was not a theologian or a churchman. His mentor was Peter Drucker, the business evangelist, the business thinker. And the way Rick Warren devised his church is he went around to people in Southern California and gave them surveys and said, what do you want out of religion? And then went home, crunched the numbers, looked at it all, and developed a church that would provide people with what they wanted, which was a feeling of purpose and community and belonging without any of the religious ritual. And that's what evangelicism, that was the birth of the evangelical church movement in the United States, the modern megachurch evangelical movement in the United States. So, I think what you have to understand is that much of religion today, as it's especially in all these megachurches, has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with the forms of religion or the spirit of religion. It has to do with being and having a purpose. And once you understand that, it's going to change the way you see the evangelical right. The book that most makes this clear in the last few years is that book, Strangers in Our Own Land by Arlene Hochschild. This is a book, by a Berkeley sociologist, anthropologist who goes and studies members of the Tea Party down in Louisiana. And one of the things that she really gets and really brings out in this book is that, a lot of these folks fundamentally believe that, they have a moral view of the world, which is that you're supposed to work hard and suffer and starve and and work in polluted plants, and the government's not supposed to give you everything. I mean, that's their view. It's not religious, although there's a religious component to it, but it's a feeling of belonging to something that gives you a sense of purpose and meaning. And I think the churches, that's what they're providing today. They're not providing religion. And so if you continue to say, well, how can these people support someone as irreligious and unreligious and irreligious as Trump, I think we're missing what religion has become.
I wanted to, when you were speaking about ideology in the context of Donald Trump, I mean, to me, it's becoming sort of ridiculous. What this man does is impromptu performances, and that's what he wants his staff to do. In other words, they're supporting casts, and they have to support him. It's like what is it called?
Improvisation.
Yeah, improvisational theater. I mean, there's no ideology there. There's just if the audience seems to reacting positively to something he says, well, that's what he's going to say. I mean, that's it. The other thing that's coming up more, I see mentioned more, is the
Patrick, let me just add one thing to what you just said. I mean, I think the improvisation aspect is right. The theatrical aspect is right. But we have to remember that there are 2 or 3 pillars of what you might want to call Trumpism. The first one, and one you can't ever ignore, is the national borders and the idea that America is being invaded by people who aren't playing by the rules and don't belong here. That immigration debate is absolutely central to what Trump is doing. And whatever you want to call it, whatever its ideology is, nationalism, whatever, it's there, and we can't get rid of it. Yeah, and same with trade. I mean, we've talked about this in other calls. Nationalism and the idea of sort of a strong national government is very much at the center of his ideology.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, if you want to talk about those things, is that I believe he wants to create a crisis, however he does it. The enemy coming from outside, the Muslims, or challenging our allies, challenging the world. Just his idea is to create a crisis so he can become a war leader, so to speak, which is what he wants to look like, a strong war leader. That's part. If you want to call that an ideology, that's okay. But to me, it's just a way of he's decided that's how he's going to get the power he wants. And I don't think, whether he believes in any of it, I don't know. The thing I wanted to mention before I get out of your way here is that 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week focus on him and all the craziness, the little craziness, the big craziness, is helping him to stay in just how he won the primaries. Just this outrageous behavior being reported as actually making any sense, which it doesn't at all. The other thing about not talking about the council system, but I think all of this activity at the congressional levels that's going on is that bottom-up kind of activity that will hopefully give us the kind of results we want, not attacking the top guy, but actually getting the power from the congressional situations and so on. I covered too much there, but anyway.
No, that was helpful. I think we should, the news media has completely obsessed itself with Trump. The question is to go out and cover the actual real world and give people a voice. I mean, one of the reasons a lot of people felt that the mainstream media was not covering them is because it didn't. And, a couple of stories every year on people in Iowa is not enough to do it. And so somehow you've got to go out and actually cover the real country.
Can I say something? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say something about the evangelical Christians, if I may. just that there, I apparently read too much, but there was an article in Harper's last this month by a former Christian evangelist about Mike Pence and how she studied and went to all the various churches that he attends and talked to his pastor. And the upshot of it all is that many of the Christian evangelists who are supportive of Trump are more interested in the Old Testament than they are in the New Testament. And Mike Pence sees his role as Daniel, who was a counsel to Nebuchadnezzar, and feels that by being such a counsel, he can save his people, the Christians. And therefore, they can use someone who is devoid of virtue and basically a non-Christian, an infidel, for the purposes of saving the nation of Christianity. It was a very interesting article, last month's Harper's.
Can I jump in for
Okay.
a sec? This is Margaret. Just to piggyback on what Daphne was saying, I mean, I think if we want to see consistency born from a somewhat simplistic ideological perspective, we could look at the federal judiciary now. And that is where there is a great deal of activity. It is consistent. It is pushing through, well, you know, what is and will be a changing framework for various aspects of our daily lives. And I guess this sort of goes back to a question that I've been wondering about this whole session, which is one of the most consistent things I hear from anybody who says they support Trump is there's always an initial clause in the sentence of, well, I don't really like everything but, or I'm not online with everything but, comma. And it reminds me of a number of the comments that we've seen from Arendt earlier in, you know, how do you draw examples from classical civilization if you were looking at a slave society? You just calmly sort of, well, we're not going to look at that part of the society, but we'll go on and look at this other section. And Roger, what you said about Christopher Hitchens' suggestion as to her then discovering, blatant anti-Semitism in the council structure, but this tendency that, you know, I don't know that anybody has any politician they've ever supported 100% always, but there is something different that seems to be akin to things we're reading about, which suggests that, you know, there's an inconsistent picture that people are taking in their heads in the name of a consistent ideology. You know, we don't like this part, but we'll go for this other section. I know I'm kind of garbled on this, sorry, but it's throwing me both in this section, in the reading, and quite frankly, in watching and reading the daily news.
Which section in the reading is throwing you, just so I understand?
The whole, I mean, what you were saying, not so much a section in the reading that's throwing me, but saying that her later moving aside from this writing because of what she discovered about the council system vis-a-vis Hitchens' argument, maybe that, I don't know enough to know if that's true or that's why she turned away. But there seems to be a willingness now in Trump world, if you will, to say, well, you know, I mean, the Trump version of that would be to say, well, that's a horrible thing or a horrible aspect to the council system, but there's another part that's great. And there seems to be a willingness to do that now that maybe one could term it a negative ideology, but there's an ability to just push aside a lot of things.
I think that's right. I mean, you know, and you brought up the court issue, which I think is really important. You know, one of the speakers at the conference is going to be making an argument about the Tea Party as a consistent and meaningful citizen action of civil disobedience in the name of bringing America back to a much more true understanding of the Constitution. And their argument is that the Tea Party movement, which has been a big part of Trump's success, is a very blanking on the word, but honorable and coherent articulation of a limited government idea that is a response to a big government ideology which has won over the last 100 years. And that's, I think, part of it. And I think what you're saying is that a lot of people say, look, I don't like a lot of what Trump's saying, but the basic thing which he wants to do, shrink the government in one's questions for you, or reduce illegal immigration. You want to give him the benefit of the doubt that that's what he's really trying to do on another hand. And not be taken advantage of in the world. If you want to give him a benefit of the doubt on that, okay, I don't agree with everything he's doing, but these are basic ideas that I share, someone says, and therefore I'm willing to take some of the bad in order to do some of the good. And I think the general additional aspect of that is, for 60 years, we've been unable or unwilling to elect someone who's going to challenge some of these growths of government and growth of globalization and growth of internationalization. And since we can never seem to win with a candidate who opposes it, even though this one's not perfect, we have to support him because he's the last chance to stop some of this stuff. I think at the beginning, that was the best argument for Trump, for people who believe that. I think at this point, to not worry that he might destroy the republic in saving it is somewhat wishful thinking. But I mean, I do think that was the best argument. And I think that explains why a lot of people have this kind of ability to say things what you just said, which is, I don't like a lot of what he's doing, and I think he's doing this wrong, but I think it's worth trying. And in that sense, whether he has an ideology or not, and I don't really think he does, he's able to present himself as the last great chance to defend a kind of ideology of small government and national greatness that a lot of people do share. I'm not sure if anyone hears me, but
We hear you, but we're just very depressed about what you said.
okay. Well, I don't mean to be completely depressing. We were supposed to read this article on Hungary with a sense of hopefulness, although the other reason that she may have taken it out of the book is that she found it to be too hopeful, and thus decided that in the future she should take it out. That was, I don't know if I said that. I was going to say that. That's another alternative explanation for why she took the epilogue out. So we're at our time for today. I want to thank you all. That was fun. I hope you enjoyed. I really love this essay on the Hungarian Revolution. One of my favorites of hers. And I hope you'll all join us in 2 weeks and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you all very much.